Hello, welcome. Thank you for clicking through to this video where I'm going to go through the sorts of things that go on inside your engine if we use stale fuel. Now, it can have several symptoms. It can sometimes require us to need more choke on an engine, and sometimes it can flood the engine. But I'll explain how things go here from the fuel tank right through the carburetor and into the engine, and I shall show how combustion occurs using stale fuel. And this is how this system works to the best of my knowledge and beliefs. I've got the fuel tank here, and we've got some fuel in it there. We've got a fuel filter, a fuel line coming off there, and down the bottom here we've got the carburettor. This is a 4-stroke carburettor, and then we've got an engine. These two here are not to scale. But what I generally do if I'm checking for stale fuel is I'll just take the fuel can lid off and have a look down there and see if the fuel is of a dark colour. We know what fresh fuel smells like, so if they got that stale smell, that weak smell, I'm not saying we should go sniffing at the fuel. We know that's dangerous. I'm just saying that we should notice how the fuel smells when we take a look inside the tank. Because what happens is, from the moment we actually buy fuel and it's nice and fresh, it's actually starting to evaporate away. There's the combustible material, the reactive substance of the material, that starts to evaporate out. So over time, over a matter of weeks, the more that combustible material actually evaporates away, it leaves behind a less combustible gum type material. So what we're left with is a fluid that's much thicker, and it hasn't got the same octane rating, if you like. Although there's less combustibility about this fluid that's left behind, there will be some, providing it's not too old. When we try and start the engine, if we haven't checked the fuel here and we have got stale fuel in, then we're going to get all this fuel now going through the system, and we don't really want that. It's going to go through the fuel filter, down the fuel lines, into the carburettor, and then it'll come out the carburettor as usual, obviously, go into the engine and try and be combusted. But as it's going through all them areas, remember this is a thicker substance, and we don't really want that in there, and over time that can actually clog the carburettor and cause problems. This stale fuel's lack of combustibility means that it's not going to let this engine run efficiently. And let's take a look why. Pistons come right down now on the induction stroke, and now it's on its way back up and it's on the compression stroke, and it's compressing that stale fuel in with the air, and now we've got the spark occurring. But the difference now is with the combustion is that because that reactive component's missing, or most of it's missing from the fuel, then it doesn't catch fire and combust as well. There isn't the same amount of explosion inside above the piston there, forcing it down at the rate it needs to be forced down at, and so it's going to lower now down the cylinder much slower as a result. The piston will rise again and force out those exhaust fumes with the stale fuel that hasn't been burnt. Because this piston during the last combustion wasn't forced down hard enough as it should have been, then it's going to turn at the bottom on the crank and come back up at a substandard rate as a result. And so when the engine cycles through its strokes and gets round to combusting again, then we're going to have the same thing there, a substandard rate of piston movement, and it's just going to be a vicious circle as the engine tries its best to run and keep going. Because this stale fuel is only partly combustible, then we're going to need a greater volume of this stale fuel to come into the cylinder and combust in order to get an amount that will help run the engine as best it possibly can, and chances are it won't run perfectly at that. But what I tend to find is that if this fuel hasn't gone too stale, then that's when I've found that it will run, as I've said, not perfectly. If it goes a little bit further than that and a bit more of it's evaporated away over a few more weeks, then I tend to find that it will run at this, providing I can adjust the carburettor to allow more fuel to go into the engine. If we start an engine then with stale fuel, obviously we're going to turn on the choke, and then of course there's going to be a vacuum building up inside the induction tube, and we're going to get a large amount of fuel coming through to start the engine. And then when we remove the choke, when the engine's got a bit warm, we find out that the engine isn't running quite right, so we put the choke back on and the engine runs again. And we can see now why. Because in this case, where we need a higher volume of fuel because we've got less reactive component and need more of it, this is what the actual choke's doing for us. It's getting more of that fuel in. So ultimately then, if the engine's given off that symptom of only being able to run on choke, then this of course can mean that we have got stale fuel in the tank. This is the kind of symptoms I have seen in the past. So when I say stale fuel, I'm talking a matter of sort of 5 or 6 weeks or more where it is combustible but not as combustible. And just for clarity then, this is why stale fuel can cause more than one symptom. This is why it can cause the engine to only run on choke. This is why it can cause flooding for an engine. And in another scenario where this fuel's going off steadily over time, we might think it's the carburettor because we're forever tuning the carburettor each time we have to use the machine. It's sometimes stale fuel that's just going more stale. These are the symptoms, and this is what can happen. If I was you, I would replace the fuel straight away and always run it on as fresh a fuel as possible. If you can't keep fresh fuel in a can for long enough because you have to store it, then use a fuel stabilizer. That's what I do. Because because a good fuel stabiliser will keep it nice and fresh and keep all that reactive substance within the fuel for up to 2 years. So the only answer to stale fuel then is to safely discard it, of course, and then clean out your fuel lines, your fuel tank, your carburettor and all the areas that the fuel goes in, so that when you put fresh fuel in, everything should be okay. And I'd like to personally thank you for watching this whole video through to the end, and if you do want to watch the full version of this video, then the link should be just here at the side. Please also have a look down at the description, the information I've got down there for you, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll be back soon. Thank you for watching.